All right, we are starting on chapter 3 today, and this is a really interesting chapter, I think, and it will really help you to understand some of the theoretical uh, theories and aspects of what we're going to be studying. It's not as dense as the first week in the first two chapters because it's just one. So we're going to look at how we study uh, gender through disciplines that aren't sociology disciplines, that aren't sociological in nature, because many other disciplines, as you might imagine, academic disciplines have studied gender. It's a very important subject, and people do a lot of, theorizing about it and investigating of it and that type of thing. So, before the feminist movement occurred, gender was actually kind of the elephant in the room. Everyone knew it was very powerful, that it had huge influence on people's lives, on societies and cultures, but it wasn't really studied in an intensely academic way. But with the beginning of the feminist movement, there was this explosion of thinking and writing and experimenting with gender. And it happened in different disciplines, not just sociology, as we said. And that's because gender is inherently interdisciplinary. It takes many, many different perspectives to really understand how gender works. So, for example, many of the degrees in women's studies at many universities is an interdisciplinary degree. So you don't just study women's studies, you look at history, sociology, anthropology, in some cases art and literature, to really begin to understand the complexity of women's women's studies and gender studies. So, although in this class, as you know, it's a sociology class, so sociology is the primary framework. This chapter, chapter 3, really gives us an insight, briefly, with brief overviews of several theoretical approaches from other disciplines, and we'll use them as well throughout the text. You'll see in upcoming chapters that although it will be primarily a sociological, approach and theoretical approach, they will bring in disciplines from or theories from psychology and analyses and other disciplines as well. So the other aspect here is that the list of potential disciplines is almost endless, as I said. But we're going to look at sociology, or excuse me, psychology and anthropology in particular, and then more recently we're going to look at theories such as queer theory, globalization, development, and environment. So we're going to start with the psychological approaches to gender. So previously, what we discussed were interactional theories. And interactional theories are sociological in their very nature because they focus on groups rather than individuals. You can't interact with yourself. I mean, you can, but you understand what I'm saying. So if you're talking about an interactional theory, that implies that it involves other folks, other institutions and settings, and that type of thing. So although both psychology and sociology overlap a bit, psychology generally focuses on the individual, and sociology focuses on groups. So the psychological theories that we're going to learn about in this chapter fit the category of what are called individual approaches. So the first one we're going to explore is called sex difference research. And as you can tell from its name, uh, it this is the first psychological theory. This one is as much about research as it is about theory. Sex difference research. That's its name. The research is part of the title of it. So the objective of sex difference research is to identify whether a wide range of traits, dispositions, and behaviors differ significantly between men and women. In other words, sex difference research is interested in finding out how gender works from the inside out rather than from a sociological theory how the outside affects our ideas of gender. So some researchers concluded that differences in cognitive abilities, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these studies and heard a lot about them. Um, they're very popular studies. They're cited a lot. So they're the studies about the cognitive differences between the sexes. And they can be grouped into three primary areas: mathematical abilities, verbal abilities, and visuospatial abilities. So, for example, some of the research suggests that women are better at decoding facial expressions, whereas men are better at visuospatial tasks that involve things like aiming, or throwing a ball, for instance, where you see visuospatially where you want the ball to go. Here's the problem with that. That is that that those differences, which as we'll see, with research, there are those differences to a certain extent. They're generally presumed to be hardwired. Okay, they're inevitable, immutable, etc. So years of subsequent research have sometimes confirmed those findings, those differences, and sometimes they've contradicted them, which means they can't be exclusively hardwired, right? If they're not true all the time. And so the other thing to remember is all those studies of the visuospatial, mathematical, and verbal abilities were based basically on standardized SAT scores. So it was biased because basically only high ability students were tested, and then there were other problems as well. For example, the more math classes you take, the better, in general, not for everybody, but generally, the better you're going to get at it, right? So many studies have shown that boys are really encouraged to take math classes more often than girls. So that means that boys' better performance on math tests, standard math tests, might be a reflection of social pressure rather than inherent superiority in that field, such as math. And of course, there's a way to look at that, to research that, to find out if that's true or not. And the way you do that is you look at the global variation in men's and women's math abilities from research studies in other countries, international research studies. So, for example, in France and Israel, boys perform slightly better than girls. This is all math we're talking about now. Girls perform equally well in England and in Japan as boys. Girls outperform boys in Iceland, Finland, and Thailand, interestingly. And another example is Japan sends no girls to the International Mathematical Olympiad, but neighboring South Korea sends up to 7 girls to that. So they obviously have girls who are doing well in math. So, to research or not to research? Because what we just discussed about math scores should highlight some of the problems with this type of research, with sex difference research. So one of the goals of the early sex difference researchers was motivated by the women's movement, was to challenge those unfavorable stereotypes of women, like they're not good at math, they can't, you throw like a girl, that type of thing. And they felt that their research would demonstrate the absence of any essential differences, which would therefore help the goal of reducing inequality. So, because they believed that the differences were created by the actual structure of society, which could be changed. An example of the structure of society criticism would be boys being encouraged to take math and science classes and girls not being encouraged to do that. So that's structural, right? But that isn't exactly what the researchers found. It's kind of interesting because the most important findings were that there were fewer differences than previously thought between men and women, and that the magnitude of the importance of those differences was relatively small. So, in other words, yes, there were differences in those abilities of math, verbal ability, and visuospatial ability, but the differences weren't that many and were not as great as had previously been believed. So, what's the critique of sex difference research? Well, there's 2 points to consider. The size of the sex differences. Now, we just learned that with looking at it through more recently, that the size is not as great as was originally thought of the differences between abilities. And then the second is how those differences stand up. This is interesting across age, ethnicity, different societies, social contexts, and time periods. So, for example, if the differences are actually rooted in biology, then they wouldn't change over time. They shouldn't change over time. There's no reason they should if they're biological in nature, but they do change over time. So the ratio, here's some examples. The ratio of boys to girls identified as, quote, highly gifted based on SAT scores in the early 1980s was 13 to 1, 13 boys to every one girl. By 2005, that ratio had dropped dramatically to 2.8 to 1, 2.8 boys to one girl from 13. Okay. The text also describes differences among racial and ethnic lines of math abilities. So, a final criticism of sex difference research is with the this is really an important point here. It's with the conceptualization of sex difference in general. So the three categories studied in this type of research, once again, mathematical, verbal, and visuospatial. How are these abilities conceptualized and what gender biases might be hidden within them? In other words, why were those three categories even chosen? So there's plenty of other categories one could look at. So the bottom line of sex difference research, there's four important aspects. So there's actually four bottom lines. The first one is that trying to establish sex difference beyond any doubt. That's the key point. Beyond any doubt is complex and extremely difficult. Two, it will always have implications beyond the realm of scientific research because the findings can and do have real implications for gender inequality in places like schools and the workplace. Three, it's an example of what's called descriptive research, in that what it's trying to do is identify differences, but it's not concerned with explaining the reason for them. So let's just find the differences, and that's as far as the research goes. It doesn't do any deeper research into what caused those differences. And because of that, it's often difficult to make a distinction between, and this is another key point, it's hard to know if you're not finding the reason for the differences, if the differences are due to sex based on biology or gender based on social life. We'll go back to the example again of which academic disciplines and classes males and females are urged to move into or to take. Okay, we go back to the math and science example again. Okay. So the fourth point is that raises an important question, and we're going to be looking at this question and exploring it throughout the book. What's the connection between difference and inequality? Can you be different and equal? That's not the way it usually works out if you look at all kinds of things, not just gender, race, social class, that type of thing. So usually there is an effect of difference on equality, and there's usually inequality. So the researchers are often looking specifically for inequality. They point to the ways in which their findings seem to demonstrate men's superiority in the skills and abilities most valued by society. Here's another issue that's related to this whole thing and another theory. we're going to get to in a moment. One more problem with research on sex differences is that it's very binary in its approach, men and women, males and females. So it mostly assumes that there are people called females and people called males, and that there are important differences between them. And that's a key point as well. Two, binary with these major differences. So, what about the people who don't fit into these two categories? So, now we're going to move into queer theory. And it's really important to understand the word queer because language matters so much. Queer was not a nice thing to be called. It was a very denigrating term. And then it was uh, taken to be a powerful term by people in the queer community. The same thing has happened with African Americans with the term black, which always was a denigrating term. That's taken, is black is beautiful, I remember when that term came into the culture, and it was very shocking and surprising because to be black was not to be beautiful. It was a form of denigration, and then to reclaim it and say no, black is beautiful. So that's where queer theory. That's the same idea. Okay. So what it had been an insult in both cases, queer and black. A dictionary meaning of queer is not usual or eccentric or suspicious. Okay. A theory that is queer is therefore a theory that is unusual and different and different in some very important way from other theories. And queer theory can trace its origins to several sources, but to three main ones: the gay and lesbian rights movement, postmodernism, poststructuralism, and feminism. So it came out of those three movements. The origins of the gay and lesbian rights movements began in the United States with the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969. And I put up a video clip for you of that so you can see what that looked like. It was a gay bar raided by the police, and transgender men fought back. And that created really strong political action among the gay transgender community that lasted until clear into the 80s. And the movement was very powerful. It successfully had homosexuality removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which are used by psychiatrists and psychologists to diagnose mental illness. That's no longer technically a mental disorder. And in the beginning of the 1980s, there was really greater social tolerance for gays and lesbians. The movement made a huge change. But of course, not only did the movement face internal problems, but the anti-gay backlash occurred also in the 1980s and 1990s and brought about the rise of conservative elements in the political scene in the United States. And backlash grew even stronger of course, with the AIDS epidemic, and it pushed the movement in a more radical direction at that point, because by now, at that point, it was a life and death situation in the AIDS epidemic. So, as with the feminist movement in the earlier chapter that we learned about, the gay and lesbian activists began to doubt the usefulness of the frame of civil rights. Was getting civil rights the only goal? Should it be the only goal of their movement? Was there more? So early on, what they argued for were rights based on shared humanity. Not just equal rights, but the realization, let's get the realization that we're all human beings and we all share a humanity. And the assumption that we're fundamentally similar to homosexuals because we're all human. Okay? It's also the same ideology that underpins liberal feminism, as it's called. However, Some people in both of those groups, the feminist movement and the queer movement, lost faith in framing of in that way of framing the problem that we're all human, because that was a hard sell to a lot of people. Along with the backlash from the outside, both groups had internal conflicts and contradictions, just like the feminist movement did. So, lesbian feminists were engaged in a critique of male domination while fighting discrimination, and homosexuals and gay men were not especially concerned with male domination. That was not one of their major issues. And then there were other internal tensions in both movements, which focused on racial and class differences among lesbians and gays. So the result is left this lingering question: is there such a thing as a unified homosexual identity? This is where we enter into postmodernism and post-structuralism. And those two theories, with a slash between them because they're always talked about in the same breath, kind of, they cover many disciplines and many forms. So the first, we're going to have this kind of brief overview of their origins, which happened, you know, a long time ago. Okay. It happened during the Enlightenment period. I'm sure you learned about this period in history and in literature and science classes too. So the Enlightenment period was 1685 to 1815. So the 17th and 18th centuries. Much of it occurred in France. And during these approximately 130 years, something like that, society was fundamentally transformed in Europe and America in how people actually understood themselves and their societies, their relationship to their environments and nature. It was, and because it was characterized by the emergence of the beginnings of modern science. Darwin was working in this period, for example. The theory of evolution. There were all kinds of things that were happening. And so it was the beginning of modern science, and based on a profound faith in, listen to these two words now, rationality and progress. So logic and progress. So if you understood things rationally, there would ipso facto follow progress. Okay. And many of the thinkers, such as Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many others, including early sociologists, believed that science would help solve most of the problems of human societies, like poverty and war and disease and inequality. And, democracy itself is a result, a product of the Enlightenment, and so is the scientific method, both of those. So, in other words, the Enlightenment ideology saw humans in a linear evolution from lower to higher, from less knowledgeable and intelligent to more and more rational. So they saw them in a linear evolution toward a better way of living and being human beings. So how does this relate to this next theory we're talking about, which is postmodernism, post-structuralism? It relates to it in that they are a radical rethinking. These two theories, postmodernism and post-structuralism, are a radical rethinking of Enlightenment ideas as this grand story of progress. What they say, these theories, is maybe we aren't moving forward and getting better. Maybe rationality and science won't solve all of our problems. In fact, maybe they just create newer and bigger ones. Boy, do we have an example today with AI, don't we, right? So what leads to a deep questioning of this kind? To say, wait a minute, maybe science and rationality isn't, the be all and the end all. Maybe there's some downsides to that as well. What leads to that questioning? Well, primarily what led to it is the actual reality of historical events. Because it's true, science has helped cure diseases. We certainly live longer lives today, but it's also created the nuclear bomb, biological weapons, both technologies capable of destroying all life on planet. So the same value of rationality that created democracy was used by Adolf Hitler, in the application of efficiency in killing millions of Jews. Okay. Same rationality. So the aspect of this questioning and analysis that is most relevant to queer theory is the distrust of what are called grand narratives, or what postmodernists call meta narratives. Now, I'm so glad this word came up for you at this time in history, where meta, all of that, and Facebook becoming meta is something that happens so that you understand what a meta narrative is. So, the original Facebook name, where Facebook was named Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg wanted a way to rate the women in the college he went to. And he put their faces up, and yeah, these are babes and these are dogs, and whatever. It was really, that's all it was initially, and that's why it was called Facebook. Okay. So now it's Meta. So here's what a meta narrative is. It's an attempt at a comprehensive and universal explanation of some phenomenon or thing. So a dictionary definition, for example, is showing or suggesting an explicit awareness of itself or oneself as a member of its category. It's something that is clearly self-referential. Here's two examples out of your book. The bar, she said B-A-R, with a capital B, it's the name of something. The bar, she said, I know the place, been meaning to drop by. Love the name, very meta. Because the name of the bar is the bar, right? The bar's name is the bar. So it's self-referential and identifying. And then the other example is the meta gift of the year, a picture of a lamp. A lamp now. A picture of a lamp that actually lights up, is printed on plastic, embedded with electronics, and equipped with a cord and switch. But this is a picture, not a lamp, right? It's a picture of a lamp. Self-referential again. So Darwin's theory of evolution is another example of a meta-narrative. It attempts to explain that the diversity and forms of biological life is the predominant meta-narrative in biology, and some argue in social theory as well. Okay. So what's so bad about meta-narratives from a postmodernism, post-structuralism perspective? Well, as we learned in the two previous chapters we've studied, the more broadly you frame your theory or your explanation, the more likely it is to overlook the experiences of some groups of people. So the bigger, broader, more all-encompassing the theory, the more likely it is to not include, there's that word, inclusivity, to not include certain groups of people. Okay. For example, feminist theories that originated in the US and Europe usually didn't take into consideration the women in the global south, in the poor, non-industrialized nations. Also, developing meta-narratives inevitably leaves those at the margins or forces them to somehow bring their experiences into the story. Okay. It's not going to pick out people whose voices are not normally heard because you're looking for a general theory, a meta-narrative. Okay? So a key point, if I define what it means to be a man in a certain way, and you don't fit that definition, you are most likely not going to receive the privileges that go along with being defined as a man. So how does what I just said, connect to the gay and lesbian community? Well, first, postmodernism, poststructuralism argues that the master frame of civil rights that was the foundation of feminism in the early stages of the gay rights movement in the US is a meta-narrative. Civil rights is a meta-narrative because the way it's thought of, civil rights, is that those rights are distributed based on our common humanity. Well, is that true? Are the civil rights that is our meta-narrative distributed equally among the humanity? No, it's not true, as you know, because certain groups, African Americans, homosexuals, the disabled, the aged, we could go on and on and on, are perceived as suffering because of their exclusion from this common humanity. They're animals, right? Some of them. Therefore, their movements to claim those rights have to be based on a minority identity that led to their exclusion in the first place. So this is a true double bind, right? Movements organized around a civil rights frame are in fundamental, but using I should clarify this. We are talking about the post-structuralist, postmodernist theory here. It's not set in stone what's being said here. This is that theory, okay? So that from those theories' perspective, movements organized around a civil rights frame are in fundamental contradiction by using difference as a basis for identity. Because to claim rights based on prior claims of essential similarity, i.e., we're all human, but we don't treat everyone that way, right, in the society. Second, an important point of intersection between those of third wave feminism and postmodernism is that, as we talked about in chapter 2, the second wave of feminism started in the 60s, often focused on white, middle class, heterosexual women. And it didn't address lesbian women, women of color, and working class women, let alone women in other cultures and countries. So, in political terms, how do you organize a social movement around a category that you suspect might not be real for these women, for these people not just women, but men in the postmodernist society? How do you design this theory around a category that you suspect might not be real, i.e., the meta-narrative of woman? So here's 3 key features of queer theory. And this is an important point. Although the critique we just talked about, the postmodernist, post-structuralist critique of this, is it basically those theories, that critique basically originated in queer theory. It doesn't intend to actually solve those problems, because from that perspective, you would be creating another meta-narrative, right? As the author of the text says so astutely, that's the queerness of queer theory. You really want to avoid a meta-narrative, but how do you talk about it then? So first, now we're going to discuss queer theory here in detail. First, as a theoretical approach, it's distrustful of categories. And as a social movement, it works to do away with categories in their current form. And that's categories specifically related to sexuality, such as gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, homosexual, transgender, intersexual, and so on. Another point under that first point, the use of the word queer is a way of self-identifying the whole group as a generalization and to disrupt ideas of what is, quote, normal. So in other words, categories of identity are incomplete and cannot encompass all diversity from from a queer theory perspective, okay? And a key point with this is, of course, the categories change with time. For example, this is a great example, okay? Definitions of race in the US have changed every 10 years since the census began in 1790. What made you white in 1790 is not the same as what makes you white today. So, how can we assert that there is such a thing as being white? And here we get back to social construction again, which we talked about last week. The social construction of whiteness, the social construction of blackness changes over a period of time. So, was it right in 1790 or is it right today? Or is it going to be right when it changes again? The second main point of queer theory is that, and so that's the first. As a theoretical approach, queer theory is distrustful of all categories. The second, so one solution to that, being suspicious of categories, is to think of categories differently, to think of categories as being open and fluid, okay? So a gender theorist, Kate Bornstein, in your book, in your text, pointed out that gender as a system is problematic for people like her who never felt they fit in to any aspect of that system, right? And that also a key point here is that eventually, this is her quote, eventually the gender system lets everyone down. What that means, what does that mean? The gender system lets everyone down at some point. It means that at some point everyone fails to one degree or another to live up perfectly to the demands of the system. Things like uppity women, or who straight men show affection to other straight men, right? Et cetera, et cetera. We could go on with examples of things that don't fit in to that if we behave in a certain way that transgresses against the gender system, then it's going to let us down. There's going to be some consequences for that. The third feature of queer theory, it argues that it's not just a theory of sexuality and gender. I mean, I agree, it sounds like it is, but here's the key point. And in a way, the name is confusing because it's not just a theory of sexuality or gender, but it's a broad and far-reaching social theory. So the premise of it is that sexuality is an important way in which knowledge and power in society are organized, and therefore a theory of sexuality is a theory of society in general. And there's a table 3.1 in your text which summarizes the three key features of the theory. So queer theory is just as concerned with studying heterosexuality as it is with homosexuality. For example, the concept of homosociality. Homosociality is the sociability, the cooperative relationships between people of the same gender, from the same sex relationships to and that includes same-sex relationships to same-sex friendships. Homophobia, as I'm sure you know, phobia relates to fear. Homo means the same. So homophobia is a fear of or disavowal of homosexuality, is another example, which is much more likely to arise among groups of non-gay men than it is among non-gay women. Okay. Research links these attitudes to the differences in homosociality between non-gay men and women. And so they're we can be social with each other and relate socially, but the homophobia is a very different kind of thing. Okay. So now what we're going to do is explore gender theories in a global perspective. So how do we begin to create a more global approach to the study of gender? And we'll be exploring this all through the term and the text. The perception of gender from an Anglo-European context is very different from the way gender is conceived in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And in addition, it may not even be a particularly meaningful or important category of inequality in some cultures. And then to complicate matters even more, there are power imbalances between the developed nations of the global north and the developing ones of the global south. So to understand gender theories from a non-Western perspective, we first have to understand the history of the global power dynamics. So we're going to begin with the colonial period and look at colonialism and imperialism, which best describe the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world until the Second World War. Imperialism is the economic, political, or cultural domination of other nations. Colonialism is building and maintaining colonies in other regions and countries. They usually go together, but not always. So colonizers assumed that their presence lessened gender inequality among the people they colonized and controlled because their way, they were the civilized people, right? Their way was the better way. However, as anthropologists and others have pointed out, it brought varying and often negative impacts colonization did to these other cultures. For example, in some Nigerian cultures, women traditionally had a great deal of power relative to men because they had an important role in economic and social life. Also, colonial, quote, land reform resulted in women's lack of status because Europeans believed that men should be responsible for the cultivation of land instead of women. So much of women's power in many cultures and countries was lost under colonialism. In some cases, actually, there have been indigenous intellectuals in colonized countries who were already developing their theories of gender. So in India, for example, the writer Bankim Chatterjee was already criticizing the practice of secluding women in the home. So they were already aware, and the point here is the people within those countries that were colonized, it wasn't like all of them were completely unaware of things like secluding women and that type of thing. Also, as mentioned in Chapter 2, women were often leaders in movements for independence in many of these colonized countries. So a new way of thinking emerged after the overthrowing of colonial power around the world after World War II, which was, it's called the Development Project, and that's based on the modernization theory. Now, here's the modernization theory. The idea was that the post-colonial world would become like developed countries if they followed their lead economically and politically. So the way to get post-colonial countries up to speed was to mimic the political and economic systems of the industrialized and colonizing nations. Okay, they would therefore have democracy, economic prosperity, improved health, and increased equality, like Western Europe and the US. So the World Bank and the International Money Fund, the IMF, were the method that was used to implement the development project. And then there were other non-governmental agencies like the Red Cross, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders also had that same goal. So how did this affect women in those countries, previously colonized countries? The assumption was that modernization would benefit both men and women. But these organizations did not understand and or ignored the unique role of women in development. By the 1970s, it was apparent that there was a neglect of women's roles in development programs and that two issues in particular should be included. One, that women's roles in development were important, and two, that women were not necessarily benefiting from these programs. And development theory left out many women because of its emphasis on the formal economy. And that's the economy that's regulated by the government or by legal systems. And what happened was that emphasis on the formal economy disguised or made invisible the huge contributions women were making to support their families and to the economy in general in the informal economy, just like women do even in industrialized nations. Childcare, cooking, house cleaning, all of that, that's part of the informal economy that women are not paid for. There's been lots of research done as to how much women should be paid for the work they do that is the informal economy. So what in non-industrialized nations, it would included selling at local markets, childcare, cooking, house maintenance, as I just said, which we also do. So this realization that this was not benefiting the women in these countries led to the new perspective of women in development, WID, and I put up some videos and explanations of that for this week. In 1979, the United Nations passed the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, recognizing global gender inequality and that women's issues in development were unique and different than men's. So, therefore, the Gender and Development Program was created. Uh, and the idea they realized that you can't just add women and stir to a program to create meaningful programs. Okay? You can't design one program for everybody because there's very important differences among women and also unequal power relationships between men and women. So gender and development focuses on gender relations and the analyses of the roles and responsibilities assigned to both men and women. And it requires really that we re-examine and challenge existing political, economic, and social structures. It suggests that maybe the real problem is not exclusion from development, but instead it's how the global economic system itself operates. So how do you decolonize development? And the question here is in your book, do white men rule the world? Well, the answer is pretty much yes at this point. As your book says, based on an analysis of global elites, the resounding answer is yes. The inner circle of those making decisions that impact people on a global level are made up predominantly of white men. So now there became a movement which is called decolonization, originated, a process of undoing and privileges, undoing those privileges that resulted from colonization, which can mean literally restoring land to indigenous peoples, for example, or compensating them for their lost land. So finally, we come to ecofeminism and the environment. So does the ocean have a gender? I love this question. Other natural elements, do they have a gender? Well, yes, in the Romance languages, the languages based on Latin, they do. You know, those of you who speak Spanish know that the moon is feminine, la luna, right? The sun is masculine, el sol. When you say it in those languages that identify things as male or female, nouns as male or female, you think differently about them when you say it. So the relationship between women, and nature sometimes served as an important explanatory tool for the theories of male domination. Because man was always higher than nature in all these hierarchical, going way, way back to the Greeks, you know, and that type of thing. So there was, you know, God, man, woman, nature, you know, over children before nature, that type of thing in a hierarchy. So those ideas led to the theories of male domination. Other theories suggested a unique structure to feminine personality that made their relationship to nature different than men's. And in chapter 4, we're going to learn about Nancy Chateaurou's theory of gender identity development. It's very interesting. She says that women's sense of self doesn't depend on a sense of separation from others in the same way that men's sense of self does. And therefore, patriarchy, and I want to tell you, we'll come this word a lot in this class. Patriarchy literally means rule of the father. Archy means ruling. Okay, you think democracy, and then the prefix to that is who rules. It's demos with democracy, which is Greek for people, the people. Okay, monarchy, single ruler in a king or queen, and patriarchy is rule of the father. So it's male rule generally. Okay. So we're going to learn about Nancy Chodorow's rule of gender. She says that women's sense of self doesn't depend on separation so greatly as does men's sense of self. Therefore, patriarchy as an expression of masculinity reinforces a dualistic sense of nature as opposed to culture. Nature is raw, savage. Culture is, civilized. This means that nature and culture are perceived as two separate, distinct, and opposed entities or systems. Femininity, as constructed, is therefore less trapped by these dualisms. So all of those theories and ideas and trends became a loose set of theories called ecofeminism. I put something up this week about ecofeminism as well for you to look at, or ecological feminism. In general, what they do is they explore connections between the dominations of women and the domination of the environment, both physical and social. In other words, there's a link between the domination of women and our domination of the environment. And ecofeminism argues that there are important connections between environmental domination and social dominations of all kind, not just the domination of women, but social dominations of all kind. So in a way, ecofeminism is interested in the hierarchies, in hierarchies in general, and making the assumption that all hierarchies are intertwined in some way. For example, the way in which nature is often used to reinforce the inferiority of many groups in society. African Americans, for instance, and indigenous peoples around the globe have often been associated with, quote, savagery or being, quote, primitive, and therefore closer to nature. So, how are we going to use all this theory that we just went through? Okay, so this text, as they say, is a theoretical boot camp. So hopefully you're going to learn about some of these theories, and learning about them encourage you in finding your own explanation of gender, and has offered some new ways to think about it. We're going to revisit some of these theories and apply them to subjects in future chapters. I hope you don't get overwhelmed. I realize there are a lot of theories about gender, and sometimes they're contradictory, and that's okay because they're tools. Just take what you need. You don't need to learn and deeply understand them all or agree with them. They simply represent ways that social scientists think about gender. And some of them conflict with each other. Okay, we talked about that, but that's okay. So try and be adaptable. You can maybe build your own theory if none of the ones you learn about work for you. And for the rest of the text, we're going to be working on two different levels. First, the exploration of gender, beginning with how gender permeates our everyday lives and interactions, and then at the institutional level, such as marriage, work, the media, and politics and government. Then secondly, there's going to be theory alerts throughout the following chapters, and that will refresh your memory and remind you of these different theories we've learned about in previous chapters. Okay, so that's chapter 3. Read it and get as much out of it as you possibly can, and I'll see you next week.